The question haunts every leader who has ever stood at the crossroads between duty and instinct. If you were the president of a nation still healing from the deep wounds of colonization, would you risk everything, your life, your legacy, your very crown, to save a single dying creature that doesn't even know your name? For 3 relentless days, the storm had battered the eastern borderlands of Burkina Faso with a fury that seemed almost personal. Thunder rolled through the ancient baobab trees like the drums of ancestral spirits, each crack splitting the sky and sending tremors through the red earth that had witnessed centuries of struggle. The Traoré River, normally a gentle lifeline, flowing peacefully between Burkina Faso and Niger, had transformed into something monstrous. A writhing serpent of mud and debris that swallowed century-old trees whole, upturned boulders the size of huts, and carved new scars into the landscape with the indifference of nature unleashed. The local villages had retreated to higher ground, their elders shaking their heads and muttering about angry spirits. Children pressed their faces to windows, watching the transformed world outside with equal measures of terror and fascination. No one dared approach the river, even the bravest hunters, men who had faced charging elephants and territorial hippos, gave the swollen waters a wide berth. But on that 4th morning, as the last echoes of thunder faded into memory and the first tentative rays of sunlight pierced the dissipating clouds, President Ibrahim Traoré stood alone at the river's edge. He wasn't wearing the crisp military uniform that had become his trademark, nor the ceremonial robes that marked state occasions. Instead, he wore a simple olive-green shirt, now soaked through with morning mist and residual rain, and practical boots that had carried him through countless unannounced visits. To his people, his feet sank slightly into the saturated soil with each step, the earth accepting his weight as it had accepted the weight of his ancestors. Ibrahim had come to this remote stretch of wilderness unannounced, as was his habit. No motorcade had announced his arrival, no security detail had swept the area, no journalists had been alerted to document another presidential visit to the affected regions. This was how he preferred to see his country, not through carefully prepared reports delivered in air-conditioned conference rooms, not through the sanitized lens of official briefings, but through his own eyes, with his own feet touching the soil that had birthed him. He had come seeking silence, that particular quality of peace that could only be found far from the capital's endless demands and the weight of decisions that affected millions. Instead, he found something that would change everything. The sound reached him first as little more than a whisper carried on the humid air, a faint, desperate whimpering that spoke of life clinging to hope against impossible odds. It was the kind of sound that bypasses the rational mind and strikes directly at the heart, the universal language of helplessness that transcends species. Ibrahim turned toward the river, his trained senses alert. There, clinging desperately to a half-submerged root system that jutted from the eroded bank like gnarled fingers, was a lion cub. The sight hit him like a physical blow. The tiny creature, no more than 4 months old, was a study in beautiful desperation. Its golden fur, usually a crown of wild majesty, was plastered against its small frame by the relentless water. Those eyes, ancient amber eyes that should have held the confidence of kings, were wide with a terror so pure it seemed to crystallize the very air around them. The cub's small paws scrabbled against the slick wood, each movement more frantic than the last as the current tugged mercilessly at its hindquarters. The water around the root system churned with increasing violence, as if the river itself was growing impatient with this small act of defiance. Ibrahim watched in horrified fascination as the sodden earth beneath the root system began to crumble. Chunks of red clay the size of dinner plates broke away and disappeared into the churning brown water. The cub's grip was failing. Its cries, initially sharp with panic, were growing weaker, more desperate. This was a battle being lost in real time. Then, with a sound like the earth itself sighing, the entire root system gave way. In one violent splash that seemed to echo across the landscape, the cub vanished beneath the surface of the raging river. Time fractured. In that split second between the cub's disappearance and Ibrahim's response, a lifetime of memories cascaded through his mind. He saw his security advisors, their faces grave with concern. "Mr. President, you must understand. You are no longer just a man. You are the hope of a continent. Every unnecessary risk you take is a risk taken with the dreams of 30 million people." He remembered his mother's voice from his childhood, speaking of the old ways. "Ibrahim, a true leader is known not by how many follow him, but by whom he chooses to follow when no one is watching." He thought of the weight of the office, the careful balance of international relations, the delicate dance of progress and tradition that consumed his every waking hour. He was the president of Burkina Faso, a man whose single decision could affect millions, whose death could destabilize a region. All of these thoughts flashed through his mind in the space of a heartbeat. And then, without conscious decision, his body was already moving. Ibrahim dropped his leather satchel, the one containing state documents that would have made international headlines if lost, and sprinted toward the water's edge. His boots found purchase on the slick clay for exactly 3 steps before he launched himself into the river. The water hit him like a living thing with malicious intent. The cold was so complete it seemed to stop his heart for a moment, and the current immediately began to work on him with the patient persistence of a predator. This was no longer the gentle Sariba of his childhood memories, where he had learned to swim in calmer seasons. This was chaos given liquid form, a brown maelstrom thick with the debris of uprooted forests and dissolved earth. Beneath the surface, the river revealed its true violence. Sharp branches, invisible from above, clawed at his arms and shoulders with wooden talons. A submerged log, propelled by the current like a battering ram, struck his ribs with enough force to drive the air from his lungs in a stream of silver bubbles. Pain exploded across his torso, white-hot and immediate, and for a moment his vision blurred behind a curtain of agony. But even as his body screamed in protest, even as the rational part of his mind catalogued the impossibility of what he was, attempting, one image burned with perfect clarity in his consciousness. The tiny cub's face in that final moment, before the water claimed it. The terror in those ancient eyes, yes, but also something else. A kind of dignity that refused to surrender even in the face of certain death. Ibrahim fought upstream with strokes that were more warfare than swimming. Each movement was a conscious act of defiance against the river's attempts to claim him. The current pushed him back 2 feet for every 3 he gained, and debris continued to pummel him with relentless efficiency. His olive shirt tore on something unseen, and he felt the warm trickle of blood mixing with river water. Then he saw it, a flash of gold spinning in a small whirlpool perhaps 20 meters upstream. The cub was still alive, but barely. Its head bobbed above the surface for seconds at a time before disappearing again, and with each submersion, the intervals grew longer. It was no longer crying. The fight was leaving its small body with each passing moment. Ibrahim's lungs burned as if filled with liquid fire, but he pressed on. The distance between them seemed to stretch like an impossible chasm, but he refused to acknowledge the mathematics of drowning. Time was running out for both of them, but surrender was not in his vocabulary. With a final desperate lunge that used the last of his strength reserves, Ibrahim's fingers closed around the cub's scruff just as it began to slip beneath the surface, for what might have been the final time. The moment his hand made contact with the cub's wet fur, several things happened simultaneously. The small creature's claws, acting on pure instinct, latched onto his shoulder with surprising strength, digging through the fabric of his shirt and into his flesh. Blood immediately began to seep from the puncture wounds, creating small crimson clouds in the muddy water. but Ibrahim barely noticed the pain. In his arms was life, fragile, trembling, but undeniably alive. The cub pressed against his chest, its small body shivering with cold and exhaustion, but warm with the unmistakable pulse of a heart that refused to stop beating. Ibrahim could feel each rapid heartbeat against his ribs, a staccato rhythm that seemed to sync with his own adrenaline-charged pulse. But the river, sensing this act of defiance, seemed to double its fury. The current, which had been merely dangerous before, now became actively malicious. Twice the water tried to pull them both under, wrapping around Ibrahim's legs like liquid, chains and dragging him toward deeper, more violent sections where no rescue would be possible. A second submerged log, this one larger than the first, caught Ibrahim squarely in the back. The impact drove him forward and down, and for a terrifying moment, he found himself completely underwater with the cub still clutched to his chest. Panic clawed at the edges of his consciousness, not for himself, but for the small life he now carried. Above them, the surface of the river seemed impossibly distant, a wavering line of lighter brown that might as well have been another world. Ibrahim's lungs screamed for air, his vision began to dim at the edges, and every muscle in his body cramped with exhaustion and cold. This was the moment when drowning stopped being a distant possibility and became an immediate probability. This was when most people would have been forced to make the calculation that saves one life at the cost of another. Instead, Ibrahim pushed upward with a strength he didn't know he possessed. Later, he would never be able to explain where that final surge of power came from. Perhaps it was pure adrenaline, perhaps it was the desperate strength that comes to parents protecting their children, or perhaps it was something else entirely. Something connected to the ancient bond between all living things that fight to preserve life in the face of certain death. His head broke the surface and he gasped, coughing up river water and drawing in lungfuls of precious air. The cub, still pressed against his chest, was breathing but unconscious. Its small sides rose and fell with mechanical regularity, but its eyes were closed and its body was limp. Ibrahim's feet suddenly struck something solid, gravel, blessed and beautiful gravel. Then another step found purchase, and another. Fighting against the current's final attempts to reclaim them, he stumbled forward through increasingly shallow water until he collapsed on the muddy bank, his legs unable to carry him another step. Ibrahim lay on his back in the red mud, his chest heaving with the desperate rhythm of a man who had just negotiated with death and somehow won. The cub, now weak but beginning to stir, nestled instinctively into the warmth of his chest, its small body finding the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and drawing comfort from it. For long minutes they lay together in the mud, president and cub, human and wild creature, two beings who had shared an experience that transcended the normal boundaries between species. Ibrahim didn't realize he was crying until he tasted salt mixing with river water on his lips. The tears came not from pain or exhaustion, but from something deeper. A recognition of how close they had both come to ending their stories in that brown water, and gratitude for the miracle of still being able to draw breath. He had done it. He had defied every protocol of leadership, every rule of personal safety, every rational calculation of risk versus reward. No guards had protected him, no backup plans had been implemented, no safety nets had been prepared. It had been simply a man, and his decision to act when action was needed, regardless of the cost. For a moment, the wilderness around them seemed to exhale with relief. The constant roar of the river faded into background noise, replaced by a silence that felt ancient and watchful, as if the land itself was bearing witness to what had just occurred. Then the air changed. The quality of silence shifted from peaceful to electric, charged with a tension that raised the hair on Ibrahim's arms and brought his exhausted senses back to full alertness. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the trees behind him. Not one voice, but several, harmonizing in a frequency that spoke directly to the most primal parts of the human brain. It was the sound of apex predators communicating, and it was very, very close. Ibrahim slowly lifted his head, still cradling the cub against his chest. What he saw emerging from the acacia thicket would have stopped his heart if it hadn't already been racing from the rescue. 5 lionesses materialized from the shadows between the trees with the fluid grace of living water. Their golden coats seemed to absorb and reflect the filtered sunlight, creating an almost supernatural glow around their muscled forms. Each was a perfect killing machine, evolved over millennia to be the undisputed queen of the African wilderness. Their eyes, ancient and intelligent, were fixed not on him, but on what he was holding. Behind them, like a shadow given substance and will, came the male. He was massive beyond belief, his black mane catching the light in ways that suggested both majesty and menace. His shoulders were broader than Ibrahim's torso, his paws the size of dinner plates, his presence so commanding that the very air seemed to bend around him like heat waves. When he moved, it was with the confidence of a creature that had never, in its entire existence, encountered anything it needed to fear. Together, the pride formed a perfect semicircle around Ibrahim and the cub. Their paws made no sound on the muddy ground, as if they were spirits rather than flesh and blood. The circle was complete, unbroken, and utterly inescapable. Ibrahim's rational mind, the part trained in military strategy, political calculation, and crisis management, immediately began running scenarios. None of them ended well. He was a man, exhausted and bleeding, sitting in mud with his back to a raging river holding one of their young. There was nowhere to run even if his legs could carry him, nowhere to hide even if he could move without alerting their predatory instincts. He had survived civil wars, coups, and assassination attempts. He had faced down foreign dignitaries and domestic threats with equal composure. But this moment stripped away all of his political armor and reduced him to the most basic equation in nature: 1 human versus 6 apex predators, with nothing but instinct and hope standing between life and death. The cub stirred in his arms and released a soft, plaintive cry, the sound of a child calling for its mother. The effect on the pride was immediate and electric. Ears twitched forward, muscles tensed beneath golden coats, and the led lioness took a step forward that closed the distance between them to mere feet. Ibrahim's pulse thundered so loudly in his ears that he was certain the lions could hear it. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, but a deeper wisdom kept him motionless. This was not his world, not his court, not his kingdom. Here, in the mud beside the swollen river, human laws and presidential authority meant nothing. Here he was subject to older laws, ancient protocols that had governed the relationship between predator and prey since the world was young. But as Ibrahim looked into the eyes of the lead lioness, the mother, he realized with sudden clarity, he understood that this was not a hunt. This was something else entirely. This was a trial, a judgment being passed by creatures whose ancestors had been the arbiters of life and death on this continent since time immemorial. The lioness stepped. Closer still, her massive head now less than an arm's length from his face. Her breath was warm against his cheek, carrying scents of the wild that no human perfume could replicate. Her amber eyes, flecked with gold and intelligence, seemed to look not just at him, but into him, reading something written in a language older than words. Ibrahim held his breath, not from fear but from reverence. This was a moment suspended between heartbeats, between worlds, between the civilized sphere of human politics and the ancient kingdom of tooth and claw. The wrong movement, the slightest sign of aggression or panic, could shatter this delicate balance and unleash forces that no presidential decree could control. The cub whimpered again, a sound so soft and vulnerable that it seemed to pierce the very air. The lioness's ears flicked forward, and she responded, not with a growl or roar, but with a low, throaty chuff that Ibrahim would later learn was reserved for the most intimate communications between mother and child, between family members, between those who belonged to the same pride. What happened next defied every textbook on animal behavior, every documentary about the African wild, every assumption about the immutable barriers between human and beast. The lioness, still maintaining eye contact with Ibrahim, slowly and deliberately lowered her massive head in what could only be described as a bow. Not submission, lions bow to no one, but acknowledgement. Recognition of what he had done, of what he had risked, of the choice he had made when faced with a drowning cub and a raging river. The gesture lasted only seconds, but it contained lifetimes. In that brief moment, species barriers dissolved, and two beings who should have been natural enemies found common ground in the most fundamental of emotions, the drive to protect the young and innocent. Ibrahim's eyes filled with tears for the second time that day, but these came from a different source entirely. This was not the relief of survival or the exhaustion of struggle, but awe in its purest form, the recognition that he was witnessing something that would never be repeated, never be fully explained, never be captured in any language ever spoken. The lioness raised her head and took another step forward, bringing her face so close to his that he could see his own reflection in her golden eyes. Her rough pink tongue, designed to strip meat from bone, extended slowly and gently licked his forehead with the tenderness normally reserved for grooming cubs. The world stopped. Ibrahim's breath caught in his throat as the impossible became reality. No apex predator in recorded history had ever been documented performing such an act on a human being. Grooming was sacred among lions, reserved for family, for pride members, for those who belonged to the inner circle of trust and affection. She was claiming him. The lick lasted only a moment, but it branded itself into eternity. The rough texture of her tongue, the warmth of her breath, the absolute trust required for such an intimate gesture between natural enemies, all of it combined to create a memory that would outlast empires. As the lioness stepped back, something extraordinary began to unfold. The other pride members, who had remained frozen in their semicircle of watchful attention, began to move. But their movement was not predatory or threatening. It was ceremonial, ritualistic, as if they were following ancient protocols that predated human civilization. One by one, the lionesses approached. The first, a sleek female with scars along her flank that spoke of battles won, rubbed her face gently against his side, leaving her scent mark in a gesture that among lions signified acceptance into the family unit. Another circled slowly behind him, her massive flank brushing against his back with the casual intimacy of a cat marking territory, except that in this case, she was marking him as belonging rather than as property. The cub, fully conscious now, and recognizing the familiar scents and sounds of its family, began to squirm with increasing energy in Ibrahim's arms. But none of the lionesses made any move to take the cub by force. They waited. They accepted his guardianship. They trusted him to return their young when the moment was right. From the trees above, birds took silent flight, as if recognizing that they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. Somewhere downstream, a crocodile that had been basking on a partially submerged log slipped back into the water and disappeared, sensing that this stretch of river now belonged to forces larger than its own ancient authority. The air itself seemed to vibrate with significance. This was not just an encounter between human and animal. This was ceremony, ritual, sacrament. This was the kind of moment that gets woven into the mythology of a people, passed down through generations until it becomes legend, then truth that transcends mere fact. Then came the final test. The alpha male, who had remained motionless throughout. The entire ceremony took his first step forward. The earth seemed to vibrate beneath his massive paws, and Ibrahim felt every muscle in his body lock with primal recognition of ultimate predatory power. This lion was biblical in his proportions, a creature that seemed to have stepped out of the collective unconscious of humanity itself. His mane was not just black, but seemed to absorb light, creating a corona of darkness around his massive head. His eyes were molten gold, ancient beyond measure, holding depths that spoke of countless hunts, countless challenges met and overcome, countless decisions of life and death rendered with the absolute authority of the apex. Every instinct Ibrahim possessed screamed warnings that seemed to emanate from the very DNA of his species. This was the moment of ultimate judgment, when the king of beasts would decide whether this human interloper would be accepted or eliminated. But the lion did not roar. He did not bare the teeth that could crush a skull with casual ease. He did not lower himself into the attack crouch that would have been the last thing Ibrahim ever saw. Instead, in a gesture that would echo through the ages, the great lion bowed, his magnificent head, not in submission, but in recognition. It was a salute from one leader to another, an acknowledgement that transcended species and spoke to something fundamental about courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to risk everything for the innocent. The bow lasted for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the lion raised his head and looked directly into Ibrahim's eyes. In that gaze, Ibrahim saw acknowledgement, acceptance, and something else. A bond forged not in dominance or fear, but in mutual respect for the choices they had both made in their respective roles as protectors and leaders. With trembling hands and a heart so full it felt ready to burst, Ibrahim slowly rose to his knees. The mud clung to his clothes and skin like a baptismal blessing as he gently placed the cub on the ground between himself and its mother. The small creature, now fully alert and aware, immediately recognized its family and let out a series of soft mews that were answered by equally soft chuffs from the assembled pride. The mother lioness approached her cub and began the ritual of reunion, sniffing, nuzzling, licking, reassuring herself that her offspring was whole and unharmed. Her purr, deep and resonant, filled the air with vibrations that seemed to restore natural order to the world. But even as she ministered to her cub, the lioness's eyes never left Ibrahim. Their gazes met and held across the small distance that separated them, and in that exchange passed something that had no name in any human language. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition, or simply the acknowledgement that some acts transcend the boundaries between species and touch the universal heart of life itself. Slowly, carefully, the lioness lifted her cub by the scruff of its neck and turned toward the forest. But this was not a simple departure. What followed was a procession that would have put royal ceremonies to shame in its dignity and significance. As the pride began to retreat toward the tree line, each lioness paused beside Ibrahim. Some brushed against him with casual familiarity. Others looked directly into his eyes with expressions that seemed to hold entire conversations. One of the younger females actually nuzzled his hand with her massive head, leaving him with the scent of wild places and ancient wisdom. But the lions were not finished with him. As Ibrahim remained kneeling in the mud, overwhelmed by what had just occurred, he heard the soft pad of returning footsteps. The mother lioness, having deposited her cub safely among the trees, had come back. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her posture relaxed but alert, and issued a low chuff that seemed to carry the weight of invitation. From the shadows emerged the rest of the pride, and what Ibrahim witnessed next would be described by ethologists for decades to come as the most remarkable display of interspecies social behavior ever documented. The lions were forming an honor guard. They arranged themselves around him, not in the threatening semicircle of their initial approach, but in a formation that spoke of protection and respect. The mother lioness took position at his right side, the great male at his left. The other lionesses spread out in a staggered formation that would have done credit to any ceremonial military unit, and then they began to walk, not toward the forest, but toward the distant clearing where Ibrahim's abandoned vehicle waited with his frantic security detail. The lions were escorting him home. Ibrahim rose on unsteady legs and found himself moving forward, guided by instincts he didn't fully understand. The pride kept pace with his human stride, their massive shoulders. Occasionally brushing against his legs with casual intimacy, they walked in complete silence, their paws making no sound on the forest floor, their breathing synchronized with his own. The forest seemed to part before their unusual procession. Baboons watched from safe distances with expressions of confusion and awe. Birds fell silent in the trees above them. Even insects seemed to pause in their endless buzz and hum, as if nature itself was holding its breath to witness this impossible parade. The walk lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but it felt eternal. With each step, Ibrahim became more aware that he was participating in something that would never happen again, something that existed outside the normal flow of time and consequence. He was living in a fairy tale, a myth, a story that would be told around fires for generations to come. As they approached the edge of the wilderness, where the ancient forest gave way to the cleared spaces of human habitation, Ibrahim could see his security detail waiting in the distance. Even from several hundred meters away, he could make out their tense postures, their drawn weapons, their obvious state of high alert and barely contained panic. The lions seemed to sense the approaching boundary between worlds. Their pace slowed, then stopped entirely, as if they had reached an invisible line that marked the edge of their domain. The mother lioness stepped forward one final time and repeated the gesture that had begun this impossible encounter. She pressed her forehead gently against his chest, holding the contact for a long moment while her purr vibrated through his entire body. When she stepped back, the other lionesses followed her example. Each offered their own version of farewell, a brush of flank against leg, a gentle nudge with massive head, a look that seemed to carry promises of remembrance. The great male came last, and his farewell was as magnificent as everything else about him. He pressed his enormous forehead against Ibrahim's shoulder with gentle but unmistakable pressure, imprinting this moment into flesh and memory with equal permanence. As Ibrahim walked the final distance toward his waiting team, the lions remained behind, arranged in a perfect line at the forest's edge. They didn't disappear immediately into the trees. Instead, they stayed, watching, ensuring his safe passage to the human world, guarding the boundary between their realm and his until he was safely delivered to his own kind. Ibrahim's security team stood frozen in disbelief as their president emerged from the wilderness. His clothes were torn and stained with mud and blood. His face bore scratches from branches and debris. His eyes held depths that seemed to reflect experiences beyond normal human ken. But he was walking steadily, smiling with quiet contentment, and utterly alone. Behind him, barely visible in the forest shadows, the faint outlines of watching lions could be detected by those who knew where to look. The security chief, a veteran of a dozen conflicts who prided himself on his unflappable professionalism, would later describe the scene as the most terrifyingly peaceful thing I have ever witnessed in 30 years of military service. No one spoke as Ibrahim approached. No one raised a weapon or called out warnings. The entire human world seemed to recognize that they were witnessing the conclusion of something sacred, something that demanded silence and respect rather than questions and explanations. When Ibrahim finally reached the perimeter of the cleared area, he stopped and turned back toward the forest one final time. The lions were still there, still watching, still guarding this threshold between worlds. Slowly, with the dignity befitting a president and the humility befitting a man who had just been granted the greatest honor of his life, Ibrahim bowed deeply toward the forest. The lions accepted his gesture with a stillness that spoke louder than any roar could have. Then, in perfect synchronization, they turned and melted back into the green shadows of their domain, leaving behind only the memory of their presence and the promise that some bonds transcend every boundary that humans can conceive. Unknown 2. Ibrahim. High above this entire extraordinary encounter, drone cameras had been recording everything. The footage, initially captured as part of a routine environmental survey of flood damage, had documented the impossible. A human president walking from the wilderness in the company of a full lion pride, treated not as prey or threat, but as family. Within hours, the footage was being analyzed in Paris by bewildered wildlife experts. By midnight, it had reached news desks in Johannesburg, Lagos, and Cairo. By morning, it was trending on every social media platform from Nairobi to São Paulo, from London to Tokyo. Scientists scrambled to provide explanations. Behavioral specialists theorized about trauma bonding and pack mentality. Religious leaders spoke of divine intervention and the harmony of creation. Political analysts debated the symbolic implications of a president who was literally accepted by the apex predators of his continent. But for every expert who tried to categorize and explain, there were thousands more who simply watched in wonder. The footage struck something primal in the human psyche, a recognition of moments when the ordinary world cracks open to reveal glimpses of the miraculous. Children in schools across Africa began drawing pictures of lions walking beside a man. Musicians composed songs about the president who spoke the language of the wild. Poets crafted verses about leadership that earned respect rather than demanding it. Months later, after the world had moved on to other headlines and other wonders, Ibrahim returned to the river. This time he came not as a president seeking solitude, but as a man seeking reunion. The flood damage had healed, the Sareba ran clear and calm, and the forest had reclaimed the scars left by the storm. He walked the same path, wore the same olive shirt, carefully mended, and carried the same quiet hope that some miracles repeat themselves for those who believe in them. The chuff came from the trees before he even reached the riverbank. Low, familiar, welcoming. From the acacia grove emerged a young lion, no longer a cub but not yet fully grown, his mane just beginning to darken around his powerful neck. His gait was confident, his eyes clear and intelligent, his coat shining, with the health of a creature raised in love and safety. The young lion approached without hesitation and pressed his forehead against Ibrahim's thigh in a gesture of recognition that transcended species. Those same golden eyes that had once been wide with terror now looked up at him with something that could only be called friendship. From deeper in the forest came other shapes, other familiar forms. The pride had not forgotten. In the months since their first meeting, they had continued to thrive, and their acceptance of this strange human friend had become part of their collective memory, passed down through their own mysterious channels of communication. Ibrahim spent the afternoon sitting with lions in the dappled shade of acacia trees, sharing a peace that had no need of words or explanations. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the lions' coats, he rose to leave. But he carried with him the absolute certainty that he was never truly leaving, just as they were never truly staying. Some bonds exist outside of time and space, in the realm where all living things recognize their fundamental kinship. Years passed. Ibrahim continued to lead his nation with the wisdom earned from those moments beside the Sareba River. His policies reflected a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of all life, and his leadership style bore the mark of someone who had learned humility from the greatest teachers of all, the wild things who had chosen to trust him. The story spread beyond documentaries and news reports to become part of the oral tradition of West Africa. Elders told it around evening fires, adding their own interpretations and embellishments. Children acted it out in playgrounds, taking turns being the brave president and the grateful lions. Musicians incorporated it into praise songs, and painters captured their own visions of that impossible walk through the forest. But the truest testament to what had occurred was simpler and more profound than any artistic interpretation. In the wilderness along the Traoré River, on quiet mornings when the mist rises from still water and the first light filters through ancient trees, locals sometimes report seeing a solitary figure walking among the lions, not as their master, not as their prey, but as their brother. And on certain evenings, when the wind carries sounds across the savannah that might be the roar of a distant lion or might be something else entirely, children in villages throughout Burkina Faso pause in their play and listen carefully, because they know that somewhere out there, in the place where the human world meets the wild world, a bond exists that proves some truths are too large for words and too important for disbelief. The river flows on, carrying new stories toward distant seas. The lions hunt and mate and raise their young according to patterns older than human memory, and somewhere between the ordinary world of politics and policy and the sacred world of fang and claw, a man who happened to be president learned that the greatest leadership comes not from commanding respect, but from earning it in the ancient court of the wild heart. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with love despite fear. That leadership is not about power over others, but about the power to connect with others across every barrier that seems to divide us. And that sometimes, in moments of crisis when everything familiar falls away, we discover who we really are, not by what we command, but by what we choose to save. The story ends, but the truth it contains continues. In every act of unexpected kindness, in every moment when someone risks safety for the sake of another's welfare, in every instance when natural enemies discover common ground, the spirit of that muddy riverbank lives on, and in the hearts of those who heard this tale and felt something stir within them, something wild, something ancient, something eternally hopeful. The lions are still walking, and the president is still among them, and the miracle is still unfolding in an eternal present where love transcends fear, where courage defeats impossibility, and where the wild heart of true leadership beats in harmony with the pulse of all living things. The footage of Ibrahim's encounter with the lions became more than viral content. It became a cultural phenomenon that transcended borders, languages, and belief systems. Within weeks of its release, Lion President was trending in 17 languages. The video had been shared over 50 million times across all platforms, but more importantly, it had sparked a global conversation about leadership, courage, and humanity's relationship with the natural world. In classrooms, from Stockholm to Sydney, teachers used the story to discuss environmental stewardship and moral courage. Business schools analyzed Ibrahim's decision-making process as a case study in values-based leadership. Theological seminaries explored the spiritual dimensions of his communion with the wild. Even military academies incorporated the incident into their courses on leadership under pressure, examining how a man could earn the respect of apex predators through actions alone. The ripple effects extended far beyond academic discussions. Conservation organizations reported unprecedented increases in donations and volunteer applications. Wildlife sanctuaries across Africa found themselves overwhelmed with visitors seeking their own connections with the continent's great predators. The tourism industry in Burkina Faso, previously struggling to compete with more established destinations, suddenly found itself hosting dignitaries, celebrities, and ordinary people from around the world, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the president who walked with lions. But perhaps most significantly, the story inspired a new generation of leaders. across the globe. Young politicians began incorporating environmental protection and wildlife conservation into their platforms with a passion that previous generations had reserved for economic policies. The phrase, leadership in the wild, entered the political lexicon, representing a style of governance that prioritized authentic action over political theater. Dr. Sarah Chen, a leading expert in animal cognition at Oxford University, spent months analyzing every frame of the drone footage. Her team's findings, published in the Journal of Interspecies Communication, challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and social behavior. What we're witnessing here isn't just remarkable, Dr. Chen explained to the BBC. It's revolutionary. The lion's behavior demonstrates complex social reasoning that we previously thought impossible. They didn't just recognize Ibrahim as non-threatening, they actively incorporated him into their social structure through ritualized behaviors that mirror their own acceptance ceremonies for new pride members. The study identified 17 distinct behavioral patterns in the footage that corresponded to documented lion social rituals. The forehead touching, the scent marking, the protective formation during the escort. Each action had precise parallels in lion-to-lion interactions within established prides. Most remarkably, Dr. Chen continued, the alpha male's final gesture, that bow, appears to be a novel behavior, something we've never documented in the wild. It suggests that lions may be capable of creating new social protocols in response to unprecedented situations. They essentially invented a new way to honor a being they recognized as deserving respect, but who existed outside their normal social categories. The scientific community was divided. Skeptics argued that the lion's behavior could be explained through conventional theories of animal psychology, confusion, territorial uncertainty, or simple curiosity. But a growing number of researchers supported Dr. Chen's more radical interpretation, that the encounter represented genuine interspecies communication at its highest level. While scientists debated and politicians pontificated, the people closest to the land had their own interpretations. In the villages along the Traoré River, elderly storytellers added the tale of President Ibrahim and the lions to their repertoire of traditional narratives, but they told it with the authority of those who had always known such things were possible. The spirits of the ancestors watch over all leaders, explained Amadou Diarra, a respected elder from a village 10 kilometers from the encounter site. But they only reveal themselves to those whose hearts are pure. The lions were messengers, testing the president's soul. He passed the test. The local interpretation differed significantly from the scientific analysis or the international media coverage. Here, the story was understood not as an anomaly requiring explanation, but as confirmation of ancient truths about the relationship between true leadership and the natural world. Children in the village began leaving small offerings at the riverbank, where the encounter had occurred. Flowers, carved wooden animals, drawings depicting humans and lions living in harmony. These spontaneous shrines became pilgrimage sites for visitors from around the world, creating an unlikely fusion of local tradition and global attention. The village elders, initially wary of the international interest, gradually embraced their role as guardians of the story's deeper meanings. They established formal storytelling sessions for visitors, sharing not just the tale of Ibrahim and the lions, but the broader oral traditions that provided context for understanding such miraculous encounters. The encounter changed Ibrahim in ways that became apparent to everyone who knew him. His speeches took on a different quality, less focused on policy details and statistics, more concerned with larger questions of purpose and meaning. His weekly radio addresses, broadcast across Burkina Faso in multiple local languages, frequently included references to the wisdom found in nature and the importance of listening to voices that spoke without words. Leadership, he said in one particularly memorable address, is not about imposing your will upon the world. It is about finding your place within the world's existing harmony. The lions taught me that strength without compassion is mere brutality, and authority without humility is mere tyranny. His cabinet meetings, once focused solely on economic indicators and development projects, now regularly included discussions of environmental impact and sustainability. Ministers who had previously dismissed conservation concerns as luxury issues for wealthy nations found themselves implementing policies that prioritized ecological health alongside economic growth. Ibrahim's international diplomatic style also evolved. At United Nations assemblies and African Union summits, he spoke with a moral authority that transcended traditional power dynamics. His words carried weight not because of his military might or economic influence, but because he had earned something far more valuable: authentic respect based on demonstrated character. Other world leaders began seeking his counsel on issues ranging from conflict resolution to environmental policy. The Lion President, as international media had dubbed him, became a symbol of leadership that drew its strength from service rather than dominance. Unknown to the outside world, the lions themselves had been changed by their encounter with Ibrahim. Dr. Marie Konate, a Burkina wildlife researcher who had been studying the Sareba River pride for over a decade, documented behavioral changes that persisted long after the famous encounter. "The pride's territorial behavior has shifted," she noted in her field journal. "They're less aggressive toward human presence in their range, more tolerant of researchers and park officials. It's as if their successful interaction with President Ibrahim has altered their fundamental relationship with our species." The young lion that Ibrahim had rescued grew into a magnificent adult, but he retained unusual behaviors that set him apart from typical male lions. Unlike most males, who leave their birth pride upon reaching maturity, he remained closely bonded with his family group. More remarkably, he showed no fear of humans. Not the dangerous lack of caution that leads to human-wildlife conflict, but a calm confidence that suggested he understood the difference between threat and friendship. Local guides began reporting sightings of this distinctive lion observing human activities from safe distances, not stalking or hunting, but watching with what could only be described as curiosity. Photographers who ventured into the area with proper permits found themselves subjects of study by their intended subjects, as the lion would position himself where he could observe the human observers. The behavior spread through the pride over time. While they remained wild lions in every important respect, hunting, mating, defending territory according to their natural instincts, they had developed what researchers termed selective human tolerance. They seemed capable of distinguishing between humans who posed threats and those who meant no harm. The story of Ibrahim and the lions catalyzed something unprecedented in modern African politics: a continental movement toward what became known as ecological leadership. Across the continent, political candidates began incorporating wildlife conservation and environmental protection into their core platforms, not as afterthoughts or concessions to international pressure, but as fundamental principles of good governance. Young people in particular embraced the symbolism of the encounter. University students organized lion walks, peaceful marches calling for environmental protection and authentic leadership. The imagery was powerful. Thousands of young Africans walking together, carrying banners depicting lions and humans in harmony, demanding leaders who would earn respect rather than simply claiming it. The movement spread beyond politics into business, education, and civil society. African entrepreneurs began incorporating environmental sustainability into their business models, not just as marketing strategies, but as core operational principles. Educational curricula across the continent were revised to include more intensive study of local ecosystems and traditional ecological knowledge. Artists, musicians, and writers found endless inspiration in the tale. Galleries in Dakar, Lagos, and Johannesburg hosted exhibitions exploring themes of human-animal connection and authentic leadership. Musicians from Mali to South Africa composed songs that used the encounter as a metaphor for various social and political challenges. The story had given contemporary African culture a new mythology, one that bridged ancient wisdom and modern realities, that spoke to both local traditions and global concerns, that offered hope for a different kind of future. 5. Years after the original encounter, Ibrahim made another unscheduled journey to the Sereba River. This time, he was not alone. Accompanying him were a small group of African heads of state, environmental scientists, and documentary filmmakers. They had come not seeking spectacle, but hoping to understand something fundamental about leadership and our relationship with the natural world. The young lion, now in his prime, was waiting. As the group approached the riverbank, he emerged from the acacia grove with the confidence of a creature completely at ease in his domain. The other world leaders, despite their extensive briefings, fell silent as the magnificent animal approached their group with unhurried dignity. What followed was not a repeat of the original miracle. Miracles by their nature cannot be manufactured or scheduled. Instead, it was something perhaps more profound, a demonstration that respect, once earned, endures. The lion approached Ibrahim directly, ignoring the other humans entirely. He pressed his forehead against the president's chest, in the same gesture of recognition that had marked their reunion years earlier. But then, in behavior that left the observing scientists speechless, he moved through the group of visiting leaders, offering each a brief but unmistakable acknowledgement, a gentle nudge, a moment of direct eye contact, a brush of his magnificent mane against outstretched hands. It was as if the lion understood that these humans had come seeking wisdom, and he was prepared to offer the most valuable lesson in his power. That authentic leadership is recognized and respected by all living things, regardless of species. The children who had grown up hearing the story of Ibrahim and the lions were now young adults, and they carried the tale's influence into their own leadership roles. Fatima Sawadogo, who had been 8 years old when the encounter first made international headlines, was now leading environmental protection efforts as a junior minister in Burkina Faso's government. That story taught me that courage isn't about being unafraid, she explained to a gathering of young African leaders. It's about acting with love, even when you are afraid. President Ibrahim didn't jump into that river because he was fearless. He did it because he couldn't bear to watch an innocent creature die when he had the power to help. Across the continent, similar voices were emerging. Young leaders who had internalized the lessons of the lion encounter were applying those principles to challenges ranging from climate change to social justice. They spoke a different language than previous generations of African politicians, less focused on tribal or national divisions, more concerned with the interconnectedness of all life. These emerging leaders faced the same fundamental challenges that had confronted their predecessors: poverty, corruption, environmental degradation, the lingering effects of colonialism. But they approached these problems with a different philosophy, one that had been crystallized by a president's spontaneous act of compassion beside a swollen river. They understood that true strength came from service, that authentic authority was earned through demonstrated character, and that the health of human societies was inseparable from the health of the natural world that sustained them. A decade after the encounter, the United Nations commissioned a comprehensive study of its global impact. The results were unprecedented. The story of Ibrahim and the lions had directly or indirectly influenced environmental policies in 43 countries, inspired the creation of 17 new wildlife conservation organizations, and motivated over 1 million young people to pursue careers in environmental science or conservation. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the story's deeper influence. It had given humanity a new metaphor for leadership, one that emphasized connection over dominance, service over power, courage over calculation. Political science textbooks now included chapters analyzing the lion president model of governance. Business, Schools taught case studies examining how authentic leadership, demonstrated through actions rather than proclaimed through words, could generate levels of trust and loyalty that traditional authority structures could never achieve. The encounter had become a touchstone for discussions about everything from corporate responsibility to international diplomacy. Religious leaders across faiths found in the story confirmation of their deepest teachings about the interconnectedness of creation and the moral obligations that come with power. The image of a human leader earning the respect of apex predators through selfless action resonated with spiritual traditions that emphasized service, humility, and courage. The Sariba River flows on, carrying its ancient waters toward distant oceans, bearing witness to the endless cycle of seasons and the timeless drama of life and death played out along its banks. The lions continue their ancient patterns, hunting, mating, raising young, defending territory, according to instincts honed over millions of years of evolution. But something has changed in the relationship between human and wild, between civilization and nature, between power and respect. The story of Ibrahim and the lions has entered the permanent mythology of our species, taking its place alongside the great tales that define who we are and who we aspire to become. In villages across West Africa, grandmothers still tell the story to wide-eyed children, each telling adding new details, new interpretations, new meanings. The tale has become part of the oral tradition, woven into the cultural DNA of a continent that has always understood the deep connections between human and animal worlds. In universities around the globe, researchers continue to study the footage, searching for new insights into animal cognition, interspecies communication, and the mysterious bonds that can form between natural enemies. Each analysis reveals new layers of complexity, new reasons for wonder. In the hearts of individuals everywhere who have heard this story, something stirs, a recognition that the ordinary world contains possibilities for the miraculous, that courage and compassion can transcend every boundary, that true leadership is not about commanding respect, but about earning it through actions that speak louder than words. And somewhere along the banks of the Sariba River, where the morning mist rises from still water and the first light of dawn filters through acacia leaves, the spirit of that impossible encounter lives on, not as memory, not as history, but as eternal truth, that in moments when everything familiar falls away, we discover who we really are not by what we command, but by what we choose to save. The river remembers. The lions remember. The earth itself remembers. And in that remembering, the miracle continues, unfolding in an eternal present where love defeats fear, courage conquers impossibility, and the wild heart of authentic leadership beats in perfect harmony with the pulse of all living things. The story ends here, but the truth it contains is just beginning. In every act of unexpected kindness, in every moment when someone risks safety for another's welfare, in every instance when natural enemies discover common ground, the lions are still walking, the president is still among them, and the miracle is still unfolding. Listen carefully to the wind across the savannah. Sometimes, if conditions are just right, you might hear something that could be the distant roar of lions, or the quiet voice of a man who learned that the greatest leadership comes not from commanding others, but from earning their trust through love made visible in action. The tale is told, but the truth endures. And that, perhaps, is the most miraculous thing of all.